Yep, and then just want to share. This. Yes. Okay.
And when I go to the videos, I can just tab over and it'll still, okay.
And is this some presentation mode? Are we good?
It looks like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Dan Albertson, Chair of the Department of Information Science, and on behalf of the Department of Information Science and Graduate School of Education, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Bobinski Lecture. The Bobinski Lecture is what I refer to as our highlight event of the year, where we welcome a prominent and forward-thinking scholar to share their wisdom on our field, our research, and our future. The Bobinski Lecture is supported by the George and Mary Bobinski Lecture Fund, which was started through a generous gift from Dr. George and Mary Bobinski. George Bobinski is Professor and Dean Emeritus of the School of Information and Library Studies here at UB, and his wife is a former librarian in Western New York, more specifically here in Amherst. George Bobinski is attending this lecture virtually this evening, so please join me in thanking the Bobinskis for their generous support of the lecture. I also want to acknowledge the co-sponsors for tonight's reception, the Western New York Library Resources Council, the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, UB Libraries, and UB Special Collections for supporting our wonderful refreshments and venue. Now it is my pleasure to call upon Dr. Saguna Schenker, professor in the Department of Information Science, to formally introduce this year's Bobinski Lecture.
Hello and welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here. My name is Saguna, and I would like to open today with a territorial acknowledgement in the interests of thinking collectively about cultural competence and cultural humility. We are gathered here today in the traditional territories of the Seneca Nation, which is a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And this is a place where members of the Six Nations have cared for lands, waters, and knowledge in these territories over 1,000 years through a democratic agreement called the Great Law of Peace. Along with my colleagues here in the Department of Information Science, I am so pleased to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Nicole Cooke is the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair and Professor at the University of South Carolina's School of Library and Information Science. Dr. Cooke's scholarship leads our field in so many significant ways, and she has made distinct and long-standing contributions to understanding the diversity of information behavior, resisting mis, dis, and malinformation, and supporting social justice in information and library work. On a personal note, I first had the opportunity to hear Dr. Cooke speak when I was a doctoral student years ago at a workshop she hosted on cultural competence and the need to strengthen LIS curricula and practice. At the time, long before then, and since then, her scholarship has offered a vision for us of reconsidering and reframing our research and our teaching in LIS through a critical lens. I'm so happy we have the wonderful opportunity to learn from her today. Please, again, join me in welcoming Dr. Cooke.
Thank you so much. And I think Sagun is going to have to go on the road with me and introduce me all the time. So tonight, we're going to have a little technology, so bear with me. But I just want to begin by thanking you all for inviting me. It is an extreme pleasure and honor to be here. And I was here in 2017 for a research talk. So I said to Dr. Julian last night, it's always wonderful to be invited back. So I'm very, very grateful. And everyone has just been wonderful, and it's just been a great experience. So thank you. And thank you to the Bobinskis for sponsoring such an important lecture, an opportunity for folks to learn more about library and information science. So tonight I want to talk about what I'm calling the competent humility model, and we'll get more into that in just a moment. And so my goal tonight for our time together is really twofold: to introduce this model and really kind of emphasize this idea that when we're talking about equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, those things are stigmatized for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons that they are stigmatized is because they're considered soft skills. And that's not really important. We need to teach them how to do metadata, and they need to know how to catalog. They need to know how to conduct a reference interview. And all of those things are super important. But I think what goes parallel is this internal work that we do as professionals. Because if we're not being responsive to our diverse communities, it doesn't matter what information we give them. It doesn't matter what skills that we can manage to impart to them. If they feel like we don't want them in our libraries or in our institutions, or that they are somehow unworthy of our time and service because we are not culturally competent and we don't have cultural humility, all of the work we do is for naught. And then on another note, you know, equity, diversity, and inclusion, social justice, I always say the pendulum swings, you know, every 5, 7, 10 years, depending on what's happening. And we have a lot of people jumping on bandwagons, you know, when the pendulum swings. And then I always tease and say, when the trend moves on to something else, then I'm left to clean up the mess. And this is work that is ongoing. This is not something that you jump into. It's not something that you just do because the Joneses are doing it, or because the other school is doing it, or the other system is doing it. We have to do this work because we want to do this work. And with that said, this work is not for everyone, right? I do believe on a larger scale, it's everyone's job, but realistically, there are probably some that I would prefer not to do this work and actually cause more harm and damage. But you are not those people. So I'm going to talk about the model and talk about why this is a soft skill that we all need to be invested in. So before we get started, I want to introduce you to Nona. And then it's about 30 seconds, and then I'll talk to you a little bit more about Nona.
Because it's more basic than the meat. The meat is just the meat. No, it doesn't work that way. Vegetarian means no meat at all and only veggies. Oh, come on, you have to give me the vegetation to the veggie. Yeah, but I know put it that much. Just a little bit of the tender.
All right, so let's talk about Nona. So a very dear colleague of mine sent this to me, and her message to me with the video was, this is what diversity is like in librarianship. And I was like, oh, that was a little spicy remark, but okay. But she's right, right? So if we think about Nona, and Nona is talking about vegetarianism, right? But it could be for any underrepresented or marginalized group. So when we have issues of EDI, social justice, it could be about the LGBTQ plus community. It could be about the disabled community and those who are able-bodied versus those who are not, right? And you think about some of these efforts that are going on in different libraries, different institutions, and you get to a certain point And then people will think, oh no, well, we can't go any further than that. And really what's happening is people are essentially being performative, and they get to a certain level and then they become uncomfortable. And then they say, oh no, we can't do anything more than that. So now I'm not saying that Nona doesn't have good intentions, because I think she does. I think Nona doesn't understand vegetarianism. And why would anyone not want some chicken in that dish? Right? And so Nona is not a vegetarian. Nona doesn't understand vegetarians or their dietary requirements. And so I want you to just think about, as I go through the competent humility model, can Nona change? You know, there's a lot of stigma about the age differences and whether older adults can actually change, right? I have an 84-year-old mother, so I personally say yes and no, right? But it depends on the issue. And should Nona change? All right, so we'll visit Nona later. So I really do think that in the case of Nona, she's trying really hard, right? But she doesn't quite get it. And it really does fly in the face of everything that she's used to, all right? So she's dealing with a lot of things in trying to learn about this. And I think that this kind of example can be applied to any outsider of a community, right? Who's trying to learn and get involved and become empathetic and immersed in something that's just very different for them. So I want to give you a couple of examples of how this appears in other venues. All right, so I am not a member of the Beehive, so no worries. So Beyonce is Beyonce, right? I don't have to tell you all that she's, you know, a global superstar, et cetera. Everyone loves Beyonce. The Renaissance tour was the biggest thing last year. And now that she's released this country album, oh no, she cannot be a country artist. There are no Black people in country music, when in fact, Black people originated country music, but that's a different lecture. But just to say, the people who claim to love Beyonce, oh no, but this is a bridge too far, okay? Next to Beyonce, that is Ralph Yarl. He is a young man who was actually shot in his own neighborhood because he rang the doorbell of the wrong home. And the older white man said that he feared for his life, and he shot him and almost killed him. All right, so then think about, you know, when we're trying to integrate neighborhoods, right? In 2024, we are still integrating neighborhoods. I won't get into too much example, but when I moved to Illinois, I was in central Illinois, and also when I moved to Columbia, South Carolina, I both times had elderly white neighbors knock on my door and essentially kind of give me the up and down and wanted to know if I was going to be acceptable to live next to them. Now I knew what they were doing. And so what they said was, oh, we heard you're a professor. Yeah, if that makes you happy, right? And so, you know, I know who to keep my distance from, right? But the idea is that people will say, oh, I live in a mixed neighborhood and, you know, I have all kinds of friends, until they move in next to you, all right? Or until they ring your doorbell unexpectedly. Another example, this woman on the screen here, she is being interviewed to be a head coach of an NBA team, right? And so we just finished a really amazing year of women's sports and women's basketball, and we celebrate women. We want women to rise to the highest ranks, except when it's in the NBA. We can't have a woman coach an NBA team. They have to stay in the WNBA, where they literally make 100 times less than their male counterparts. Okay. On the right-hand side here, a new study talks about online racism is linked to PTSD symptoms in Black youth. Now, we've had all of the key players from all the social media companies testifying to Congress ad nauseum, right? And what they mainly talk about is how Instagram and Facebook and the social media platforms are detrimental to young girls and their sense of self and their body dysmorphia, which is all true. But what we're not talking about is the online racism, right? So if we're going to ban TikTok, that's a whole other lecture too. But if we're going to ban these platforms, we need to be talking about all of the issues instead of saying one form of harm is acceptable, but the other is not. All right, so, I'm at the University of South Carolina, so I have to give you a Gamecock example because we won. So the women's basketball team at the University of South Carolina a couple weeks ago won their third title. And are people following women's college basketball? Okay, so I've got a few. So really what was happening is all year, Caitlin Clark, a young white woman player at the University of Iowa, an amazing player. But the narrative has been all season that she has broken all of these records. She's the best player to ever emerge. Debatable, right? The records that she has broken, she has not really broken. There are actually Black women from the 70s. One is from a historically Black college and university who was playing with a man's basketball and didn't have any of the accommodations that our women players have now. So there's debate about that. But when the Gamecocks won, CNN, one of our major media players, they gave a headline saying that South Carolina won and won their third championship, et cetera, and had a picture of Caitlin Clark. All right, so we are focusing, we have a white gaze here that is not acceptable. And CNN had to face backlash and a social media campaign before they changed it. And so if you go back, the picture is gone, right? So I had to get this screenshot of when it was still up. And folks were on TikTok and, all of the social media kind of backlash. And then finally they changed it and added a picture of the team that actually won the championship. All right, so why are we getting to the point where some things are acceptable and some things are not? And why are we at the point where we can't get past a certain point, right? So we have these performative efforts for equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice, and we get to the point of discomfort. And for whatever reason, it could be issues of power, right? If we go any further, then that means I need to relinquish some of my power. It could just be as simple as fear. Could be a combination of those things. And as we can see from our little elephant friend here, it could just be denial. It could be ignorance. It could be avoidance, awkwardness, right? This, you probably hear a lot, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And I contend, or I argue that in order for EDI and social justice to be sustainable and long lasting, we have to get over ourselves, right? We have to be willing to be uncomfortable and put in the work, the time, and the effort to get over that discomfort. Okay, so what's happening is that people are in their comfort zones and they are in a zone of fear. And that's where, people are comfortable, right? So when you want to push past that discomfort and those barriers, you move into the learning zone and the growth zone. And the learning and growth zones are scary, they're messy, they require relinquishing of power and fear, and that's really where the equity is going to start to come in. And this is why a lot of initiatives that we may see don't really last a long time, right? But kind of the big joke is, for those of us who have to get grants, we only have equity while we have grant money, right? And then everything goes away and then we have to start over. But this idea that, you feel safe and you feel in control. And I think Nona really felt safe and control with her dish, right? And this is how she's made it for decades, and this is what everyone loves. And how could someone not like it, right? And so ultimately, she hopefully may get into the learning and growth zone in terms of vegetarianism, right? But we are also hoping that in terms of racial equity and all of the equity for all of the isms that we all experience, we need to find a way to get to the learning zone and to the growth zone. So this is just another example of this same kind of zone graphic. And this one is specifically for becoming anti-racist. The one on the top is moving beyond white supremacy, but it could be for any topic, right? It could be for moving towards vegetarianism. It could be for, learning to love dogs instead of cats, right? You name it. There's going to be a learning curve and a series of zones that we need to go through in order to get to the point where it becomes naturalized for us to say, yes, this is what's happening in this particular oppressed or marginalized group, and this is how I'm going to use my privilege and power to work towards equity for everyone. All right, so again, this is going to be a process, and not everyone is invested in what this long-term process looks like. So inclusion isn't just inviting to someone to sit at your table, it's believing that they belong there. So how do we get from just inviting people to actually believing that they should be there? And this is where we're going to start talking about the competent humility model. And I think that there are lots of ways that people can embark on this journey, right? But for me, in the work that I do and with curriculum and different things within the profession, I focus on a couple of things. So I focus on critical self-reflection, I focus on radical empathy, and I focus on cultural competence and cultural humility. So I do just want to give you a couple of definitions so we're all kind of on the same page. So critical self-reflection refers to the process of questioning one's own assumptions, presuppositions, and meaning perspectives. All right, so why do we believe what we believe? Have we been socialized with Western norms, if we went to school in the United States, right? And what do those norms teach us to value? They teach us to value whiteness. The norms teach us to value heterosexuality. They teach us to value ability, right? And they teach us to value wealth and affluence, right? And they teach us other things as well. But anything outside those norms, that's when people become othered and marginalized, right? So when we get to the critical self-reflection, we're going to have to unlearn some things, and we're going to have to question, why do I believe that? And what are the other perspectives that I've been missing? Then we have radical empathy. And radical empathy transcends traditional empathy. It involves actively advocating for the well-being of others, speaking up against injustice, and fostering an inclusive and equitable work environment. Radical empathy challenges the status quo and promotes systemic change. All right. So I wanted to give you those two definitions because we're not going to focus on them explicitly, but they do very much inform the competent humility model. So what's on the screen here is the maybe traditional or original, one of the original models of cultural competence. So both cultural competence and cultural humility emerged out of the applied health sciences literature. So you're talking about your nurses and your doctors and your drug counselors and your social workers and lots of other folks who are traditionally front-facing professionals and who are working with communities that are different from them. So I always tease and say librarianship, we like to be behind the curve. So when Applied Health Sciences was talking about this, and this article was in the late 90s, late 80s into the 90s, we came to cultural competence just, a little later. And so, we are also a front-facing service profession, and we are also dealing with very diverse communities. And so for cultural competence is the ability, let's see. Okay. Cultural competence is the ability of a person to effectively interact, work, and develop meaningful relationships with people of various cultural backgrounds. Cultural background can include the beliefs, customs, and behaviors of people from various groups. So the model that I started working with, you can see part of it here on the screen. And I'm going to give you, talk about the categories of the various models in just a moment. But I want to point out that the models that emerged out of applied health sciences are linear, right? And so it implies that you're going from one end to the other and you start from a deficit and next thing you know, you're an expert, right? And so when I started working with cultural competence, and I'll come back to that slide, I wanted it to be in a cycle. I wanted to imply some type of movement. Because when we're talking about cultural competence, we're talking about another journey or process, you know, similar to when I showed you the growth zone and the fear zone. And this is something that's going to take time. And if I'm culturally competent in Columbia, South Carolina, that does not mean that I'm going to be culturally competent in Buffalo, New York, right? Because we have very different communities. So you can be culturally competent in multiple places, but it's not something that you can just apply to any situation or any group. And I do believe that we can backslide on this cycle, right? So if this is something that you're not keeping up with, if you are not constantly surveying your community and finding out what they need and what they want and how they operate, you can go from proficiency back to pre-competence. All right, so just because you achieve it doesn't mean that you automatically maintain it. You have to work to maintain it. So let me just go back to cultural humility and give you that definition. So cultural humility, also from the applied health sciences, incorporates a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, to redressing the power imbalances and to developing mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic partnerships with communities on behalf of individuals and defined populations. All right, so I like to tell the students, essentially this means that you don't know everything and that you have to be willing and you have to be humble enough to realize, I don't know everything. And there are going to be communities and groups and different situations that I need to learn more about in order to be effective in my service to those communities. Okay. So when I did the model that I just showed you, this appeared in my 2016 textbook entitled Information Services to Diverse Populations. And this is the model that I presented and that I taught, and that is in that particular book. So now that I'm working on the second edition to the book, I felt like it was time to update the model and see how things were progressing, you know, in the spirit of cultural humility. And so what I did was I took the model, the previous model that I showed you, and I asked people to tell me what works about this model for you and what doesn't work. What would you like to see? What's missing, right? And how do you interact with the model, right? With this idea that if there are going to be people who are averse to the previous model and it's not going to speak to them, and we're going to have difficulty kind of getting them on that cultural competence journey. And another thing I wanted to emphasize, and I think it's there in the previous model, but not emphasized as much as I would have liked. And that's, you know, in hindsight and experience, is this idea of how cultural competence and cultural humility work together. So I always say that they dovetail together and they inform one another, right? So if you think about cultural competence and how you gain awareness of communities that are different from you, and you work to the point where you can celebrate and actually seek out other perspectives, that requires a certain level of cultural humility to engage in that process, right? And if you have cultural humility, you want to keep learning about communities that are different from you. So to me, they are pretty symbiotic. And one of the reasons that I wanted to emphasize this more explicitly in the revised model is that I would say maybe 2020, 2021, there were some scholars that were saying that cultural competence is passé and we don't need it anymore. We need to do cultural humility. And the irony of that statement. And so wanted to bring the two back together a little bit more explicitly. So now I'll tell you a little bit more about these categories. So these symbols, or excuse me, not the symbols, the cycle is the same, right? It's still in a circular framework to imply motion. And you can still, kind of backslide a little bit and, not be where you want to be if you don't work to maintain your cultural competence. Now, it might be easier if I just come over here and show you, and sorry if you can't see as much here. So when we started, if we start here in the purple, what is now called cultural repudiation and harm. It used to be called destructiveness. Okay, so destructiveness is when you really detest another group or a culture in a way that results in active harm of an erasure of said groups. So this is one of our extreme examples. So if we have the KKK, if we have hate groups that are actively enacting violence on a group, that would be formerly destruction, but now cultural repudiation and harm. Okay, and hopefully that's not the norm. Hopefully we don't, have a lot of people that we need to address this with, but at times they are changing, right? So when I started doing this work, I had far fewer examples of destructiveness than I do now, unfortunately. So the next one, we have cultural indifference. And cultural indifference used to be called incapacity. And so cultural indifference, these are still people who hate other groups or other communities that are different from them, but they're not actually trying to erase them or harm them or actually kill them, right? And so cultural indifference is cultural injustice without the component of intentional action. Those who are indifferent are still averse to people who are different from them, but they are not making active strides to harm or erase them. Those who are indifferent may still tokenize or fetishize those who are different from them. They lack cultural literacy, and they are culturally insensitive and callow. They rely on false and offensive stereotypes, and as a result of that, they spread misinformation and disinformation about others. All right. The third one here, we have cultural avoidance. And this used to be cultural blindness. And I should have said earlier, I had 98 people respond to this. And I'm really grateful for the folks who took time to engage with the model and to say what worked for them and what didn't work for them. And one of the most frequent comments was that cultural blindness is ableist, and they wanted that category changed. So we changed it. All right. But when you get to cultural avoidance, this is when you have people who are inherently avoiders, and they want to avoid that there are differences amongst cultural groups, but actively choose to dismiss and ignore these differences. They neither defend nor advocate for other cultural groups, but they don't seek to destroy or erase. But their silence and apathy make them complicit in their perpetuation of structural barriers and discrimination. So these are the folks that are going to tell you, I don't see color. I love everyone the same. And it's a very, on paper, if you hear someone say that, or you read that someone has said that, oh, that's probably not bad. They're just not taking a side. But in reality, and when you are actually engaged with it, it can really be harmful. And it is a very purposeful stance, right? And I actually think a lot of people are in this cultural avoidance stage. And so when I was asking people to go through the model, how do we get people from cultural avoidance to pre-competence, right? So in this model, it changes from purple to kind of the green, and the categories in green, that's where cultural humility emerges, right? And you have pre-competence, competence, cultural dexterity, and safety, and cultural activism. And this is where people acknowledge that they don't know everything and that they want to learn to do better when it comes to groups that are different from them. So we have pre-competence, and essentially pre-competence is the state of cultural awareness. You're learning more, you're doing better, but you just don't know what to do with it. And, you might hear people say, how can I help? Or how can I do more, right? So they're still they're in that learning and growth phase, but they still haven't figured out how to make it tangible, okay? Now, when they've learned how to make it tangible, that's when they're in the competence stage. So this is where action starts, right? And so you have all of this great new knowledge and awareness, and now you're going to put it to work. And this is still part of that learning and growth stage. When you get to competence, this is where people are starting to figure out that they need to give up some of their power and privilege, that they may have to really overcome a fear, give up some of their power. And this is where stuff starts to get messy, right? Because if they're giving up too much and they're too uncomfortable, it's going to be very easy to go back to pre-competence or even back to cultural avoidance. So how do we get people to the action part, right, is where, I spend a lot of my time. So to finish up, we have cultural dexterity and safety. And that category used to be called proficiency. And proficiency used to drive me crazy, right? Because it says to me that, or it allows people to say, I've done this class with Dr. Cooke. I was telling Dr. Hands and Dr. Sam earlier that people have said, oh, if I take a class with Dr. Cooke, it's going to look good for me. And it's like, if they take a class with me, they're automatically culturally competent, or however they're perceiving this, and that they can just check a box, right? And that's not how this works. And so was very happy to change proficiency to something else. So if we get to dexterity and safety, dexterity implies that the culturally competent are maintaining their competence with continuous knowledge and active work. They may also be competent in multiple areas or in multiple cultures. Their activity is not only at the micro level, but also at the macro level, right? So at the community level, the national level, the international level. And it also extends to larger venues. All right. And then cultural activism added this particular category based on the respondents to the survey. And this is meant to imply solid action, right? So think about the other graphics that I gave you. This is clearly and solidly in the growth category. So you are taking all of this knowledge, you're taking some of the action that you've already started doing, and it's just part and parcel of your daily life and your daily activities, that if I hear a microaggression in the meeting, I'm just going to speak up. Like, I'm not even thinking about it anymore, right? And I'm past that fear and that comfort zone of what do I say? And I don't want to offend anyone. Now you're just like, no, why did you say that? Right? And you're being proactive, right? And the action is just part of who you are now, right? And so everyone's not going to reach cultural activism, right? And there are lots of different ways to do that. So I tell the students, that are working in various library types, you can be culturally active in your information literacy instruction, right? You can be culturally active in your reference work. We have this wave of, and I hope it stays, this wave of reparative cataloging, right? You can be culturally active in any of the work that we're doing, right? But it's about a solid intention of how you are going to be active and work towards equity for everyone. Okay. Oh, and I should have been going through all these slides when I was telling you the categories. All right. But that's okay. You get to see how pretty the model is. All right. So competent humility gives us context. And context think about it, and this is how I describe it to students, you think about it as peeling back the layers on the onion, right? Nothing happens in isolation. Everything has some history or some type of emotion or some type of something that's attached to it that makes it what it is, right? But if you're not part of a particular culture and you just see, you know, Beyonce, right? You have to have that context to understand the significance of her re-entering the country music space, right? And so it tells us about history. It gives us compassion. It gives us understanding. Hopefully it will give us some urgency. It gives us humility, and it gives us empathy for the experiences of others, right? And so this is why, you know, I work so hard with cultural competence and cultural humility. Now I have another video for you. And so this is from TikTok, and every time Beyonce or Taylor Swift drop a new album, the commentary and the think pieces are extraordinary. And I'm sure someone other than me will study this at some point. But it is good for examples. So when I had this screen up earlier, Nicole said, "Oh my God, it's her." And I was like, oh, okay. So apparently this woman is hated on TikTok because she does not like Beyonce's album. I have no idea. But what I want to show you is someone reacting to her.
Hey guys, so I want to weigh in on this with an example that doesn't have to do with this, but it absolutely does, and you'll see where I'm going with this. Many years ago, a wonderful horror film called Get Out came out, and it received all of this critical acclaim, right? And all I knew was that it was a great movie. There was some social commentary on it, and that it was supposed to be scary, right? So I go into it just with that lens, just as a white person taking in a horror movie. And I left and thought, oh no, that movie was fine. But it wasn't what I expected it to be. I don't know what I expected, but I expected something different. And I put that opinion on the internet. And then a person who is in my life, who I respect their opinion, who also happens to be Black, said, that's a hot take. Why? And so I explained it. And she hit me with the knowledge that she did not need to provide me. She did not need to educate me on why it was such a brilliant film, but she did. And thank God, because that opened up my eyes to the context of the film. I was watching a movie. I was not taking in any context around said movie, okay? And because I didn't take in the context, and I didn't take in the nuance, and I didn't take in the history of Black people and white people, I walked away like, no, it was fine. Once my eyes were opened and I thought, how very dare I go into this culturally significant movie with my white people lens, I realized this is a brilliant movie. And I went in not appreciating it for what it was. This feels like that. This feels like Sam went in and said, I just don't like this music, which is a valid critique, okay? Valid critique. However, when you don't take in why Beyonce created this album, why she included the people that she included, why she included the genres she included, why she covered the songs she covered, when you don't take in all of the context of what is happening behind the scenes, and you're just looking at this album as you just don't like the way it sounds, that is doing a disservice to this album, doing a disservice to Beyonce, and doing a disservice to you. When you can listen to this album, and I have never claimed to be part of the Beehive until last.
I'm going to stop it there because we don't need to hear about the Beehive. So this could be considered a frivolous example. But I think that in a very short amount of time, it gives you an idea of the progression that people might be going through from their kind of stage of fear and comfort and moving into learning and growth. So she's learning about why Beyonce's album is culturally significant, and she's exhibiting some level of growth by putting herself out on social media. She has, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of likes and comments, and people are not always agreeing with her, right? So she is putting herself out there, right? So that's, you know, this idea of being vulnerable and taking a risk and putting yourself out there for something that you now believe in. All right. So ideally, we would like to see people get to this level on, you know, some of the more perhaps intense issues of our time, right? But we all start somewhere, right? So she is really, I think, giving a good example of context and why context matters and how context can totally change how you see something, right? And this is the type of growth in learning that I really strive to have in the classroom. Can't always have it in 15 weeks, but we try. Because this is what they need to do in our libraries and our institutions on the ground when they are dealing with diverse populations. And so I'll tell the students, you know, don't jump on the bandwagon, right, if you don't believe it, right, because I don't want you to do harm. But we also see something in our profession often where we're telling outsiders, this is what you should be doing, and that's what you should be doing, and we should be socially just, and we should be working towards equity. And all the while, the call is coming from inside the house. And our houses are not in order, and therefore we are hypocrites, right? So I use that language with them, and sometimes they kind of like, yes, you are a hypocrite, right? Because you're doing something that you don't actually believe. And because they don't have to do something that they don't believe, right? So they're doing it for optics, and that's the opposite of what we want. Okay. And this is our friend that we just saw. So just to recap with her again, this is a continuous process. So I hope that she will have the same energy and the same attitude the next time Beyonce comes under fire for whatever. Because apparently Beyonce's under fire again this week for her hair or some such. But are you going to be consistent, right? So hopefully this is just not a one-off issue for her, and that she will continue with this type of awareness and this type of vulnerability and risk-taking to inform others. All right, so there is no one way to do this work. I always tell the students, small actions matter, right? You know, we've got a lot of protests happening on different college campuses for injustice happening in the world, and everyone's not going to be comfortable protesting, right? But can you donate money? Can you write to your Congress people? Are there other ways that you can contribute to a cause that you believe in, right? Because sometimes people will get overwhelmed and they'll feel like if I don't do it this way, then it doesn't count, right? Everything counts, and it's all part of that process and that growth. So moving towards this cultural activism, right? That last part of the competent humility cycle. And it's also, you know, kind of represented in that growth and that circular model I showed you earlier. It also requires radical imagination and critical hope. So lots of things to read about radical imagination. I am a librarian at heart. If you need references, let me know. But radical imagination means that we can imagine what equity looks like. We can imagine what it looks like when we are all at the top part of the competent humility model. We can imagine what it looks like when everyone is willing and able to give up their power and their privilege in service of others, right? So if we can imagine it, we can work towards it. All right, so that's just part of the additional context for this process. And there's also something called critical hope. Sorry about that. And it's essentially, it's very much related to radical imagination, but it's also letting us know that this work is messy and that it's going to be challenging. You are going to be uncomfortable. And critical hope wants you to say, that's okay, right? Because hopefully, eventually, I'll get to a point where I'm no longer uncomfortable and this just becomes part of who I am. So these two things are giving us something positive to look forward to in this endeavor, in this work that we're doing, instead of just, kind of sitting in how uncomfortable I am and how hard this is and how challenging this is. Oh, going the wrong way. Sorry about that. All right, so let's get back to Nona, because I know you've all been thinking about Nona. And can Nona move beyond her comfort zone? Will Nona remake her dish? Will Nona embrace other non-meat dishes? Now, I don't follow Nona. I should, to see, where she is on that journey, right? But when we challenge other people, what does it look like? Do we have the radical imagination and the critical hope to think that Nona's going to become a vegetarian? Maybe, maybe not, right? But hope springs eternal. So I want to end with this idea of heart posture. And I think it's a good way to sum up cultural competence, cultural humility, and moving into learning and growth. In this, that one slide I showed you earlier about it takes more than just inviting someone to the table. You have to believe that they belong there. So when we get to this idea that we believe in this work, we believe that someone belongs in this space with us, you believe that because you have a particular heart posture, right? And this is what hopefully we will aspire to and actually achieve, not only in our profession, but everywhere, right? So the posture that I'm referring to isn't physical posture, the straighten your back or lift up posture. What I mean is the inner attitude of the heart and mind, right? Are you mentally prepared and mentally willing, able, and ready, right? I do think readiness is a big part of this whole process. Are we ready to give up our power? Do we have the right posture to move past fear and control, right? And so I don't know that heart posture is necessarily easy to achieve. I do think it's achievable, right? But it takes a lot of work. And as I was talking to Saguna earlier, it's collective work, right? So a lot of what we were discussing in the past hour or so can be considered individual work. And I do really believe that individual work is important. But when we get to that learning and growth cycle, and when we get to that part where cultural humility inspires us to act, this is where collective action comes in as well. Okay. So I want to end with this poem I found by June Jordan, who was a scholar, an activist, essayist, author. And she says, activism is not issue specific. It is a moral posture, that steady state that propels you forward from one hard hour to the next. Believing that you can do something to make things better. You do something rather than nothing. You assume responsibility for the privilege of your abilities. You do whatever you can. You reach beyond yourself in your imagination and in your wish for understanding and for change. You admit the limitations of individual perspectives. You trust somebody else and you don't turn away. So I leave you with this challenge to do something and to embark or to move further on the cycle, the model, and move out of your comfort zones, and just continue to do this internal work so we can all do the collective work. All right, so thank you so much. It has been an honor and a pleasure, and I leave you with the puppies that make this work easier to do. Thank you. Are we taking questions or? Yeah, okay.
If we have a few minutes for questions, we have a microphone back here as well.
And while people are thinking of questions, I will make a selfish plug for the next research project. Working on what I'm calling the social justice card project. Are people familiar with the race card project? So Michelle Norris, who was previously on NPR, she asked people to give me your 6-word stories about race. And she has produced a very beautiful book and really had some really in-depth and challenging conversations for people to talk about their own experiences, and then to also try and really become immersed in other people's experiences. So I'm trying to do the social justice card project. So I would love to have your 6-word stories about social justice. So if anyone cares to, I have cards and codes up here. Any questions?
Thank you so much for that talk. That was both inspiring and challenging, as usual.
That's why you love me, Heidi.
That's why. Yeah, that's why. I spend a fair bit of time thinking about that stage of self-critique, struggling with the limitations of doing that as an individual. Because I don't know what I'm not seeing about my own actions and attitudes. How do we manage that?
Yeah, and so I had a colleague in Illinois who is a world traveler. And I believe she was originally from the Midwest. And I remember her saying to me, if I hadn't traveled and met other people and talked to them, I never would have grown or begun to understand the things that were happening in the world. So I think it's a matter of getting out of our own bubbles and just talking to people and learning other things. And even when I teach misinformation and disinformation, watch other channels, read other books, that are by different authors or different perspectives. If you read fiction, read nonfiction. If you read nonfiction, read fiction. And just being very purposeful and proactive about exploring stories that are not our own. So easier said than done, right? Because it does take work. But I was telling Sam in Africa during the reception how many students I had when I was working in Illinois, and I still have them now, that will say, you're the first Black person I've had in the front of the classroom. Okay, what are you going to do about that? I may still be the only Black person they've had in the front of the classroom, right? And so they were fine in class, although I had some who were not. But did they go and take classes in other areas that they knew might challenge their perspectives? Or did they stay in their comfort zone? Right? I was also saying to them, did they drop my class? Right? Because they couldn't get past that little circle of discomfort. Because I will tell them on day one, I'm going to make you uncomfortable because these are the things that we're going to talk about. So it's that idea that they want to be purposeful and getting past that. And sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But I think that's part of how we do that.
Thank you.
So with that, we can go ahead and bring to a close our 2024 Bobinski Lecture. Join me once again in thanking Dr. Cooke for being our speaker this year and just providing us a wonderful talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's, but you know, the language you use here, culture, community, and those are feel like, even though we're still talking about that part of that language that you use that may make it easier to digest. Yes, absolutely, because if they're experiencing some level of cultural humility, they'll never be right, right? It's like how right while everybody's suffering. We can't be not high on the blessing is we always share. I just sense that it's like they no longer have the privilege of saying I'm not ready. Right, and I don't know what to say. It's like, just gotta do it. Yeah, and you have this roll with the punches, and you know, and I'm part of there's an initiative, Leaders Fellowship here at Buffalo Niagara, and it's something also in Lansing. We're talking about rebuilding the side, reinvesting in it. But including people of color, specifically leaders of color here into that initiative. So, you know, just having those I attended all these, it's alumni week, so we attended all these like trainings, and then I come and this speaking, it's like, you need those moments to also step back and that reflection. Yeah, but I like to tell our students, don't continue to do that, and it's for our own benefit as well, right?
Yeah, it's like, you know, it's one of those.
Or we're continuing to kind of like face those barriers.
They just taught you for 30 years. They're just like, let's run it back, you're staying there. And I'm like, you basically like the last person before me. You know, they don't even.
Yeah, that happened to me 3 years ago. I got severely burnt out in the nonprofit world. And I'm just like,
Oh, no, I really.
and I took a year break, I came back and I got back to the I think that's self-reflection I did, because I didn't have it. So it was really that journey. And I was just like, now with the support that I built with the fellowship, supervisors that actually see it all, it feels so much more. It's still hard. Oh, no, still hard, but it has that support. So I really appreciate it. And keep this for sure. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Congratulations. I mean,
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, it was an honor.
Congratulations. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Right.
That's right.
Hey, he's got a good question for you, but I just wanted to say goodbye.
Right.
Like, you mean that? Yeah.
Okay, now comes the hard question.
Oh, I don't know about that. Mainly just, thank you so much for not only this. but
Oh, yeah, we've got it. That's what I heard.
You know, I'm also grateful for the training that you're doing. It's sad to me that like this often falls to one course, right? Are you?
Dang, you better get on that.
About.
Where to go?
How you kickstart those.
But my simple 4 days, right, like, literally, I worry about that. I worry that I'm not. But I think that's I won't say it's a good thing, right? But a lot of people aren't working. Yeah, right, and they're not questioning. Those are the ones that are.
Gotta get after.
Yeah, so she was about integration of these components in courses that maybe aren't traditionally taught at competence.
Yeah.
I think over time.
I'm just joking.
Sweet, noble. Like,
Yeah. Oh, that's the word.
Who are you, like, Gary?
Like, they shot and 60. Yeah, that's not.
We're like so close to making that model intersects.
But I'm like watching.
She works in
Some random people.
She stepped back.
Yeah.
And she realized that she didn't have support.
And so now that she's. More like-minded people, she's much more encouraged and able to do that work. So those students who are becoming self-actualized, they have to I think they have that recognition that I deserve to be in space. And it, and it's hard because I'm, I need their own experience, right? To say, I'm not gonna let this person squash me. I'm sure. Right, and I mean, some of it's Asian experience, but, I think it's surrounding yourself with like-minded people because it's easy to become isolated. Yeah. And think, I'm the outlier, that's really, sure, that's the outlier. And like I said to her, I was like, you yourself out. But, it's a certain amount of how much am I gonna speak up? And, you get to that point that you're gonna say something. And this is why. So if you have to get rid of the other because that's what they do.
Yeah.
Right, and these are all of the voices and all of the researchers who actually say that you are incorrect. Right, so some of it is gonna have to be how much risk are they willing to take? And, how much do they believe? Right, because and I'm saying this in not graceful, but if they don't believe enough, then it's gonna be easy for someone to kick you down. Right, but if they're reaching that level where I believe what I'm saying, it will be a little easier, not easy, but easier to say.
Or at risk, and I'm like, okay, that's dramatic.
Reading in the discipline too.
Yeah.
Because we're operating.
Yes, real sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But
they got there,
I mean, they're also. The MBA is not.
And they're like.
And I'm doing the same thing. I mean, so we're in a college with journalism and management. It is very beautiful.
The girls are like.
That doesn't always happen. And the discovery is.
Shut up, Dad. Yeah, exactly. Take it.
Like, we're like, we're circles around it, right? I mean,
Oh, I'm gonna go.
And to your original question, I teach the foundation course now. I mean, I do what's on the syllabus, right? So everybody has like a comparable experience. But we did a whole parallel track in cultural humility. Right.
Yeah.
That's authentic. It's not just the directive of tick this box.
So they, every week they're doing whatever they're doing in the intro class, and then every week you're reading another chapter in that cultural humility book, right? And there's an assignment, so you're accountable in some way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I've had other colleagues who say, well, that's Nicole's job.
Yeah.
I don't teach that stuff.
Yeah.
Nicole, thank you so much. I'll let you all get on to
Yeah.
the great dinner that is sure in store.
Safe
but,
travels home. Thank you.
Yeah,
Good to see you as always.
anything you need from this point on, just don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah.
I'm sure if there's any sort of administrative things with Phyllis, we'll reach out. But anything else you need, just holler and again, thank you so much. I think you could tell your talk was very well received and appreciated by all. So, all right, well, best of luck to you on well, your year's over, right? Your academic year is over, but on grading and whatnot.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
That'll be a fun weekend.
All right, well, you all enjoy the night. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a lovely problem. Yeah, I know.
Next year. Up in the middle of the cleaner.
It's a toss up. We didn't schedule it.